At 11:47 on a rainy Thursday morning, Vivian Ashworth stood inside her father's private garage and made a joke that everyone around her thought was funny. She looked at me, then at my old gray work shirt, then at the white Porsche behind me, and said that if I could start her father's car before midnight, she might marry the poor mechanic her whole family had just laughed at. The room exploded with laughter. Her assistants laughed because she was their boss. The lawyer laughed because he knew where the money was. And her uncle, Malcolm Ashworth, laughed the loudest because he believed the joke was already over. I did not laugh. I had one hand resting on the open engine lid of a 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera RS. My 7-year-old daughter Hannah stood a few feet behind me, holding the little wooden toy car my father had carved for her when she was born. Vivian thought I had come there to fix a rich woman's broken toy. She was wrong. By midnight, that car would reveal the real will her father had hidden before he died. By midnight, her uncle would stop laughing. And by midnight, I would understand that I had not been called to that estate by accident. My name is Ethan Whitaker. I was 38 years old, a single father, and the owner of a small 2-bay garage in Stamford, Connecticut. Most people who came to my shop did not know anything about my past. They only knew I could fix problems other mechanics gave up on. That was fine with me. After my wife Caroline died, I stopped trying to explain myself to the world. I fixed cars. I raised my daughter. I paid bills late. I slept too little. I kept moving because Hannah needed a father who did not fall apart in front of her. The call from Vivian Ashworth's assistant came that morning while I was working on an old Mercedes. At first, I nearly declined. Then the assistant described the car, a 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera RS, Grand Prix white, red Carrera script, misfiring after long drives, oil pressure dropping only after the engine reached full heat. 3 specialists had failed. That was not a normal failure. That was the kind of failure someone created when they wanted a machine to look naturally broken. So I went. I should not have brought Hannah, but her sitter was sick and the school had a half day. She climbed into my truck with her lunchbox and that wooden toy car in her hands, completely unaware that the tiny thing she carried would later open the first secret Charles Ashworth had left behind. The Ashworth estate looked like a place designed to make ordinary people feel smaller. Iron gates, wet stone driveway, white mansion, silent security guards, everything polished, everything controlled. When I parked beside the private garage, Vivian Ashworth was already waiting. She was elegant in a white suit, with the kind of face that had learned not to show fear in public. At first glance, she looked cold. But I had spent enough years reading machines and people to know the difference between coldness and exhaustion. Vivian was not heartless, she was cornered. Beside her stood Malcolm Ashworth, her uncle. Silver hair, perfect suit, soft voice. He had the smile of a man who had already decided he owned the room. He looked at my truck first, then at my clothes, then at Hannah. That was all I needed to dislike him. Vivian introduced the car quickly. Malcolm made a small comment about how unusual it was for a mechanic to bring a child to a legal matter. The others smiled. I ignored them and walked to the Porsche. The moment I saw it, something tightened in my chest. I knew that car, not from a magazine, not from a photograph. I had worked on that engine 14 years earlier in Germany, before my wife got sick, before Hannah was born. Before I became the man standing in that garage with oil under my fingernails and grief hidden behind my ribs. I opened the engine lid. The first few seconds told me more than 3 specialist reports ever could. The airbox was period correct. The fan shroud was original. But the oil scavenge bracket carried a tiny mark near the weld. Mr. 04, Heinrich Müller's mark. Only a handful of those brackets existed. Heinrich had built them himself for cars he trusted only to people who understood his work. I had been a young apprentice when I helped him service 2 of them, and this was one. Then I saw the replacement part. Modern, clean, wrong. Someone had installed it recently. It would behave properly when cold, then shift under heat, creating exactly the failure Vivian had described. I told her someone had been inside the engine during the last 18 months. Her expression changed before she could hide it. Malcolm answered for her. He treated my statement like an insult instead of a diagnosis. That was when I noticed the lawyer watching him instead of watching me. In any room where money is dying, people look toward the person they believe can save them. In that garage, the lawyer looked at Malcolm, not Vivian. That mattered. Vivian asked how long the repair would take. I told her 3 days if she wanted it done properly. Malcolm smiled then, not because he was amused, because he had been waiting for that answer. He explained, with the calmness of a man delivering news he had rehearsed, that Charles Ashworth's will require the Porsche to be started publicly by midnight on the 5th anniversary of his death. If the car failed, Vivian's controlling shares would transfer to a family trust. A trust Malcolm managed. That was the moment I understood the shape of the trap. The Porsche was not broken because it was old. It was broken because someone needed it to fail. Vivian looked at me again. Her voice stayed sharp, but now I could see the pressure behind it. She was not asking a mechanic to save a car. She was asking a stranger to keep her father's company from being taken away in front of everyone who had come to watch her lose. Then she made the joke, the marriage joke, the one everyone laughed at, but Hannah did not laugh. My daughter stood behind me, small and serious, and looked at Vivian as if she had just seen an adult fail a test children understand naturally. The garage went quiet. Vivian noticed. For 1 second her face softened. Not much. Just enough for me to see that somewhere behind the CEO was a daughter who had been hurt too many times to speak gently first. Then Malcolm laughed again and the room moved on. I did not. I asked for the original keys, all maintenance records, full access to the car, and a promise that no one would touch my tools. Malcolm wanted to know what would happen if I failed. I told Vivian the truth. If I failed, she was already going to lose. By 2 in the afternoon, I had confirmed the obvious repair. By 3, I knew the obvious repair was bait. Whoever had sabotaged the Porsche had done it in a way any competent specialist could eventually find. That meant the visible failure was not the real secret. It was a distraction. Heinrich Müller never built meaningless complexity into a car. If something looked strange, it had a reason. I started looking behind the dashboard. That was where I found the second anomaly, a wire that did not belong. It did not feed the ignition. It did not belong to the gauges. It ran toward the old Becker radio, then disappeared behind a panel that looked untouched for years. Vivian came back into the garage around 4. She had been upstairs with lawyers, relatives, and board members. Her face had gone colder. That told me someone had been hurting her with words while I was underneath her father's car. She wanted to know if the Porsche could run. I told her it could. But by then, I was almost certain her father had wanted more than a running engine. He had hidden something inside that car. Malcolm appeared before I could explain further. He dismissed the whole thing as sentiment, old car, old music, old nonsense. But he was not watching the Porsche. He was watching my hands. That was when I knew he had been afraid of this moment, not the engine starting, something else, something hidden. At 5:15, Hannah changed the entire direction of the day. She walked toward the workbench holding her wooden toy car and noticed the worn leather tag attached to Vivian's Porsche key. The Ashworth family crest was stamped into it. Most adults would have missed the detail. Hannah did not. She compared the crest to a mark carved under her wooden toy car, a circle, a line, 3 small marks, the same symbol. I stared at it longer than I should have. My father had carved that toy years ago. He had never explained the mark. I had never asked. I thought it was decoration. Vivian saw it too. She wanted to know where Hannah had gotten the toy. I told her my father made it. When I said his name, Thomas Whitaker, Vivian went pale. Malcolm's smile disappeared. That reaction told me more than any confession could have. Vivian left the garage without a word and returned with an old leather folder. She opened it with hands that were not as steady as she wanted them to be. Inside was a photograph. Charles Ashworth, Vivian's father, standing beside a hospital bed, and in that bed was my wife, Caroline. For a moment the entire garage disappeared. The Porsche, the money, the people, the rain, all of it vanished. There was only my wife's face in that photograph, thin from illness but still smiling the way she used to smile when she was trying to protect me from how much pain she was in. On the back of the photo, Charles Ashworth had written 4 words, "For the mechanic's wife." I sat down because my body stopped trusting itself. For years, I believed a charity fund had covered the treatment we could never afford. Caroline had known more than she told me. My father must have known too. Somehow Charles Ashworth had been connected to my family long before his daughter ever stood in that garage and laughed at me. Vivian was no longer looking at me like a mechanic. She was looking at me like a missing piece of her father's life had just walked through the door with a child. Malcolm tried to call it irrelevant, but his voice had changed. A man only sounds that controlled when panic is close. By then, I understood 3 things. The Porsche had been sabotaged. Charles Ashworth had hidden something inside it, and Malcolm had spent 5 years making sure no one found it. The real story had not even begun yet. For a while, no one in the garage moved. The photograph in my hand felt heavier than it should have. It was only paper, a thin rectangle with faded edges, taken years earlier under the flat white light of a hospital room. But to me, it felt like someone had reached into a locked room inside my chest and opened a drawer I had spent 4 years refusing to touch. Caroline was in that photo, my Caroline. Not the version most people remembered, with bright eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. This was the version from the final months: thin shoulders, soft smile, a scarf around her head, the kind of smile sick people give when they know everyone around them is trying not to cry. Charles Ashworth stood beside her bed, Vivian's father, a billionaire most people only knew from business magazines and memorial articles. His hand rested gently on the bed rail. He was not posing like a donor. He was not standing like a man expecting gratitude. He looked like someone who had come because he had made a promise. That was what disturbed me most. For years, I had believed a nameless medical fund had covered part of Caroline's treatment. I remembered the relief. I remembered the shame. I remembered sitting at our kitchen table with bills spread out in front of me, unable to understand why one of the largest balances had suddenly been marked paid. Caroline had told me not to question mercy when it arrived. At the time, I thought she meant faith. Now I wondered if she had known more than she ever told me. Vivian stood a few steps away, watching me with the expression of someone whose own grief had just been forced to share space with mine. Until that moment, she had been the CEO of Ashworth Holdings. Distant, controlled, angry, but when she saw the way I looked at that photograph, something changed. She was not looking at a mechanic anymore. She was looking at a man who had unknowingly been tied to her father's final plan. Malcolm tried to pull the room back under his control. He treated the photograph as sentimental history, a charitable act from a dead man who had helped too many people to remember. He wanted Vivian to believe it was meaningless. He wanted me to believe I was only emotional. But his voice had changed. It was still smooth, still polite, still rich. But underneath the polish, I heard tension. A man who truly believes something is irrelevant does not work so hard to dismiss it. Vivian began searching the folder again. There were more pages inside, copies of old hospital invoices, several donation records, a list of private beneficiaries marked only by initials, and near the bottom of one page, written beside a payment date from 4 years earlier, was my wife's full name, Caroline Whittaker. The name stopped Vivian first. Then it stopped me all over again. I did not ask her to explain it. She could not have explained it anyway. She had never known. That was clear from her face. Whatever Charles Ashworth had done for my wife, He had hidden it even from his daughter. Then I noticed another name, Thomas Whitaker, my father. His name appeared beside a short note about a private consultation involving classic automotive preservation, encrypted archival storage, and mechanical access design. Most people would have passed over those words without understanding them. I did not. My father had not been a rich man. He had not gone to expensive schools, but he had understood old cars better than most men understood their own families. If Charles Ashworth needed someone to hide something inside a machine, my father would have been exactly the kind of man he would call. Suddenly, the mark on Hannah's wooden toy did not feel decorative anymore. It felt like a keyhole drawn years before anyone knew we would need it. I looked across the garage at my daughter. She was standing beside the folding chair, still holding the toy car, trying to understand why all the adults had gone quiet. She did not know that the little car in her hands might be connected to a dead billionaire, a hidden will, and the medical treatment that had given her mother a few more months of life. Children should not have to carry secrets that heavy. But that day, Hannah was carrying one anyway. Vivian closed the folder slowly. For the first time since I arrived, she did not look at Malcolm before making a decision. She looked at me. She wanted to know what I needed next. I told her I needed the maintenance records from the last 2 years, the security footage for the garage, and access to every person who had touched the Porsche since her father died. Malcolm objected immediately, not loudly. That was not his style. He objected with concern. He suggested the request was excessive. He reminded Vivian that the family lawyers were already present. He warned her that giving an outside mechanic access to private records could create legal complications. Everything he said sounded reasonable. That was what made him dangerous. Bad men do not always shout. The worst ones speak in complete sentences. Vivian listened to him, but she did not obey him. That was the first time I saw real fear move across Malcolm's face. It vanished quickly, but not before I caught it. Within 20 minutes, Alina brought me a tablet loaded with digital service records and camera logs. The maintenance records were too clean. That was the first sign. Real service records are messy. Dates overlap. Technicians misspell things. Parts get listed twice. Invoices refer to problems in language that makes sense only to the person who wrote them. These records looked curated, too smooth, too complete in the places no one cared about, and too empty in the places that mattered. The Porsche had supposedly been inspected 6 times in 18 months, 3 specialists, 2 dealerships, 1 private technician, but only one entry mentioned work near the oil scavenge system. The technician's name was missing. The invoice number had been manually entered. The date was 3 days after Vivian's board had received formal notice about the memorial clause. That was not coincidence. That was choreography. Then I opened the camera logs. The garage had 16 cameras: exterior, interior, driveway, tool room, side entrance, every angle covered. At least that was what the system wanted people to believe. But cameras are like people. They can lie. And when they lie, they usually leave behind the shape of what they are hiding. I found the gap at 2:13 in the morning, 8 months earlier. 7 minutes missing. No error code. No outage. No weather disruption. Just 7 minutes removed cleanly from the system. Whoever did it knew the security software well enough to avoid triggering an alert, but not well enough to understand that deleted silence has a texture. The same night, the maintenance record showed the Porsche had been checked for storage preparation. No technician name, no company name, just a note. That was when the story sharpened. Someone had entered the garage 8 months earlier. Someone had altered the Porsche. Someone had deleted the footage. And that someone had done it after Vivian's board had been reminded of the midnight condition in Charles Ashworth's will. I showed Vivian the gap. She stared at the tablet without speaking. Her face did not collapse. People like Vivian did not collapse in front of witnesses. But something in her eyes went still. She was beginning to understand that the people around her had not merely failed to protect her. Some of them had been aiming her toward a fall. Malcolm watched from across the garage. He pretended not to be interested. That was a mistake. Men like Malcolm spend their lives performing confidence. They forget that indifference, when performed too carefully, becomes attention. I turned back to the Porsche. The car had two mysteries now: the visible sabotage in the engine, and the hidden system connected to the radio. One was meant to make the car fail. The other was meant to make the car speak. Charles Ashworth had designed the condition around midnight for a reason. He wanted witnesses. He wanted pressure. He wanted the people who betrayed him to be present when the truth appeared. That thought made the garage feel colder. Because if Charles had expected betrayal, then he had known enough to fear his own family before he died. And if he had hidden the truth inside the Porsche, Malcolm still had 6 hours to stop us from finding it. The first real threat came just after 6. The rain had slowed outside. The estate lights had begun turning on across the driveway, one by one, making the wet stone glow. I was working under the passenger side dashboard when the atmosphere shifted. That happens sometimes. You do not hear anything, you do not see anything, but the room changes pressure. I looked up and saw a man entering the garage through the side door. Black suit, no tie, no expression. He did not look like a lawyer, a relative, or a guest. He looked like a man paid to shorten problems. Malcolm stood behind him. That told me everything. The man did not threaten me directly at first. He spoke like someone delivering a professional courtesy. He suggested my services were no longer needed. He implied that payment would be handled generously if I left immediately. He said Vivian was under enough stress without a stranger turning an old car into a family scandal. I stood up slowly. Hannah moved behind me before I asked her to. That made my decision simple. A man can tolerate being insulted. A father cannot tolerate his child being measured as leverage. Vivian came back into the garage before the situation turned physical. She understood enough from Hannah's position behind me and Malcolm's expression near the door. This time, she did not ask Malcolm what was happening. She ordered the man to leave. The word came out controlled, but it carried the first real anger I had heard from her all day. Malcolm smiled at her and told her she sounded like her father. He meant it as a wound, but Vivian did not bleed where he expected. She told him that was the best compliment he had ever given her. For the first time, Malcolm's mask slipped long enough for everyone to see the man underneath. Not the charming uncle, not the grieving brother, not the careful trustee. A man losing control of a story he had spent 5 years writing. He left the garage with the man in the black suit, but the threat did not leave with them. It stayed in the room. It stayed in the way Hannah gripped her wooden toy car. It stayed in the way Vivian stopped standing like a CEO and started standing like someone preparing for a fight. I should have taken Hannah home then. I knew that. Every good instinct in me told me to put my daughter in the truck, drive back to Stamford, lock the garage, and let rich people destroy each other without us. But then I looked at the photograph of Caroline. I looked at Charles Ashworth's handwriting. I looked at Vivian, standing in her father's garage with every person she trusted slowly becoming a question mark. And I understood the terrible thing about debts of mercy. You may not know when they are created, but sooner or later, life brings the bill to your door. Charles Ashworth had helped my wife when I could not. Now his daughter was standing in front of me, surrounded by people who wanted to take everything he left her. So I stayed. At 7:40 I had the Porsche ready to run, but I did not start it, not yet. The engine was no longer the problem. The problem was behind the dash. The wire connected to the radio led to a locked compartment under the passenger side panel. The lock was mechanical, not electronic. Old German design, precise, small. The Porsche key did not fit. None of Vivian's estate keys fit. I tried every one carefully and got nothing. Then Hannah came closer. She had been watching the keyhole with that serious expression children get when adults are missing something obvious. She held up her wooden toy car. The mark underneath it matched the Ashworth crest, but that was not all. One of the wheels had a seam so thin I had never noticed it. Hannah had. She twisted it gently. The wheel came loose. Inside was a tiny metal key. For a moment, I could not move. My father had hidden that key inside a toy he gave my daughter the year she was born. He had carried Charles Ashworth's secret into our family without telling me. Maybe he had planned to explain it. Maybe he had been afraid. Maybe he died before the right moment came. Or maybe he knew the secret would only matter if Hannah herself found it. I took the key from her hand. It fit the lock perfectly. When I turned it, the compartment opened with a soft mechanical click that sounded louder than thunder. Inside were three things: an old cassette tape, a sealed envelope with Vivian's name written across it, and a small metal box. Vivian reached for the envelope, but her hand trembled before she touched it. She knew the handwriting. A daughter always knows. That was when every light in the garage went out. The garage went completely dark. For 1 second, nobody moved. Then Hannah made a small sound beside me, and that was enough to pull me back into myself. I reached for her before I reached for the envelope. That is what fathers do. Vivian stood near the Porsche, frozen between fear and disbelief. I could not see her clearly, but I could hear the change in her breathing. The lights had not failed by accident. That much was obvious. Outside the garage, someone shouted. Then glass broke near the side entrance. Malcolm had stopped pretending. I grabbed the cassette tape, the sealed envelope, and the small metal box from the hidden compartment. There was no time to study them, no time to open anything, no time to ask why Charles Ashworth had built a secret inside his car and connected it to a toy my father had carved for my daughter. There was only the next decision. I pushed Hannah behind the Porsche and handed the envelope to Vivian. Then I took it back almost immediately, because instinct told me Malcolm would expect Vivian to be holding the most important thing. So I hid the envelope and cassette under the loose carpet beneath the passenger seat. The metal box went into Hannah's lunch bag. It was the one place no rich criminal would think to search first. The men entered quickly, 3 of them, maybe 4. In the darkness, numbers become less important than movement. They came through the side door with the confidence of men who had been told the room would be easy. It was not easy. The first man reached for me near the workbench. He expected a frightened mechanic. He found a father with a torque wrench in his hand and a child behind him. I did not fight beautifully. There was nothing cinematic about it. I struck his wrist because it was closest, then his knee because it carried his weight. He dropped hard against the concrete. The second man grabbed me from behind. I drove backward into the lift post until his arms loosened. The third came from the left, and I felt the edge of something sharp cut across my forearm before I could turn fully. Vivian pulled Hannah away from the center of the garage. In the flicker of emergency light, I saw the CEO disappear and the daughter emerge. She was terrified, but she still moved toward my child instead of away from danger. That mattered. I remember thinking that even then. The fight lasted less than a minute. Fear makes time strange. Everything stretches and collapses at once. By the time the emergency lights fully came on, 2 men were down, one was crawling toward the door, and my sleeve was wet with blood. Then Malcolm's voice came from behind us. He had Hannah. My daughter stood near the doorway, frozen, his hand clamped around her shoulder. I have no memory of crossing the distance between the Porsche and the center of the garage. I only remember stopping because Hannah's eyes told me not to do anything reckless. That is a hard thing for a father. The body wants violence. The child needs control. Malcolm no longer looked like the charming uncle. The expensive smile was gone. The kindness was gone. All that remained was a man who had spent too long believing money could turn every person into a tool. He wanted the box. He wanted the tape. He wanted the envelope. He wanted everything Charles had hidden, and he wanted me to understand that my daughter was the price of refusing. Vivian stood beside the Porsche with tears in her eyes, but she was no longer helpless. I saw it in the way she looked at Malcolm. For most of her life, he had controlled the room by sounding reasonable. But now reason was gone, and the monster underneath had finally shown itself. That kind of truth changes a person. I gave Malcolm the metal box, or at least he believed I did. In the blackout, I had switched it with an empty storage case from my tool bag. The real box was already inside Hannah's lunch bag, underneath a juice box, a napkin, and half a sandwich she had not eaten. Malcolm took the fake box and smiled. He thought he had won. Then Vivian stepped forward and did the one thing nobody expected. She slapped him, hard. The sound cracked through the garage louder than the broken glass had. For the first time that day, Malcolm looked genuinely shocked. Hannah ducked away from his hand and ran to me. I pulled her behind me and did not let go. Malcolm opened the box. Empty. The look on his face changed from anger to calculation. That was when I knew the night was not over. A man like Malcolm does not lose once and stop. He simply finds another way to make the rules serve him. Within minutes, security arrived. Then police. Vivian had managed to call them from the old wall phone during the confusion, before Malcolm realized she had moved. But even as officers entered the garage and restrained the men Malcolm had brought, he remained calm. Too calm. He reminded everyone that the trust condition still stood. The Porsche had to start before midnight. It did not matter that he had been exposed threatening a child. It did not matter that men had broken into the garage. It did not matter that the hidden compartment had been found. Unless that car ran before midnight in front of witnesses, Malcolm could still use the legal language Charles had left behind and twist it into victory. That was the cruelty of it. He had built his trap around time, and time was almost gone. At 11:56, the estate courtyard was full of flashing lights. Police cars lined the driveway. Lawyers stood under umbrellas. Board members whispered near the front steps. Family guests who had come for Charles Ashworth's memorial now stood watching a mechanic bleed through his sleeve beside a Porsche that had not run properly in years. Vivian looked at me from across the car. By then, she understood everything and nothing at the same time. She understood that her uncle had betrayed her. She understood that her father had hidden the truth inside the Porsche. She understood that my family had somehow been part of his plan, but she did not yet understand why Charles had chosen me. Neither did I. The Porsche sat beneath the courtyard lights, white paint glowing in the rain. For a machine, it looked strangely alive. Or maybe I was just tired. My arm hurt. My shoulder burned from the fight. Hannah stood close enough that her fingers stayed hooked into the back of my shirt. She did not ask if I was afraid. Children know when adults are lying. She simply stayed there, trusting me in the silent way children trust fathers before they learn that fathers are human too. I got into the driver's seat. The leather smelled old. The dashboard lights glowed faintly. The Becker radio sat in the center like an eye waiting to open. Vivian stood outside the driver's door. I could feel her watching me, not as a CEO, not as a rich woman looking at a mechanic. She watched me like the last piece of her father's voice might come through my hands. There were less than 4 minutes left. I turned the key. The engine coughed once, then died. A sound moved through the crowd. It was not loud. It was worse. It was the sound people make when hope begins leaving a room. Malcolm smiled from beside the police car. Even in handcuffs, he still believed the law belonged to him. I closed my eyes, not to pray, to listen. Engines speak before they fail. Heinrich Müller taught me that when I was young enough to believe machines were simpler than people. They are not. Machines tell the truth. People do not. I turned the key again, but this time I gave the throttle less than anyone watching would have noticed. A small breath. just enough to compensate for the heat expansion around the part that had been planted there to kill the engine under pressure. The starter turned, once, twice. Then the flat six caught. It coughed like a man waking from a long illness. Then it roared. The sound rolled across the courtyard and struck every person there silent. Vivian covered her mouth. Hannah started crying and laughing at the same time. Malcolm stopped smiling. The clock reached midnight. For 1 second nothing happened except the engine running. Then the radio turned on by itself. Static filled the courtyard. The old speakers cracked. And then Charles Ashworth's voice came through the car. Weak, old, but unmistakably alive in the one-way dead fathers can still be alive when they leave behind the right words. He addressed Vivian first. He explained that if she was hearing his voice, then the Porsche had found the person he trusted to finish what he could not. Vivian broke then. Not loudly. She did not collapse. She simply became a daughter in front of everyone. Charles explained that the family trust had been corrupted before his death. He said the documents Malcolm intended to use were forged. He said Vivian had never lost the controlling shares. The real will was hidden behind the dashboard, sealed with the same crest Malcolm had spent years treating like a family decoration. Then he said something that made the entire courtyard colder. He said Malcolm would laugh at the car. He said Malcolm would call it sentiment. He said careless men always overlook the things they believe are emotional. That was why Charles hid the truth inside the one thing Malcolm never respected, a daughter's memory of her father. The recording continued. Charles named the lawyer. He named the account used to move money. He named the doctor who had certified his condition when he was too weak to challenge the paperwork. He named the date Malcolm first tried to remove Vivian from the company. With every sentence, Malcolm's face changed, not because he felt guilt. Men like him do not fear guilt. He feared documentation. He feared proof. He feared the sound of a dead man being more prepared than he was. Then Charles said my name. Until that moment, I had been holding myself together. Barely. But hearing my name in that voice, in that place, after everything that had happened, felt like being pulled through time. Charles explained that he had known my father, Thomas Whitaker. He said Thomas had helped design the mechanical access system because electronic locks could be hacked, but a secret carried by a child's toy would survive where computers failed. He said he had helped Caroline because Thomas once helped him without asking for payment. He said he could not save my wife. He could only buy her time, one more treatment, one more Christmas, one more birthday with Hannah. I stopped seeing the crowd. I stopped hearing the rain. All I could feel was Hannah climbing into the car and wrapping her arms around me. For 4 years, I had believed I failed Caroline because I could not save her. Now, a dead man was telling me that the time I thought we had lost had actually been given to us by a father trying to repay another father's kindness. The final part of the recording was for Vivian. Charles told her not to trust the loudest man in the room. He told her not to confuse family with loyalty. And then he said the sentence that would later be quoted in every article written about the Ashworth case. He told her to trust the father who came with a child, because a good father is harder to buy than any lawyer. That was when Malcolm lowered his head. That was when Vivian opened the hidden envelope. And that was when the night finally turned against him.